Good morning. Excellent. I was testing that. So thank you, Cindy and Allison, for having me here and the entire Bio-IT World team. It's indeed a privilege to be here, giving a plenary keynote. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. As Cindy said, I lead data and digital innovation programs in PharmSci R&D at Pfizer. A few of my colleagues from Pfizer are also here in the room. So if I say anything wrong, please correct me. We've been on this journey in trying to sort of get our hands around our data. I think it's recently been started to call as digital, but let's stick to data. I wanted to sort of share our perspectives and our experiences in this journey that we've been on for the past 5 to 6 years. Before I start, though, I have a question for the audience to get you started. If you had $1 million to spend, would you spend that money on improving the quality of your data, or would you invest that money in buying the most advanced machine learning platform? Just with a show of your hands, who would spend that money on improving the quality of your data? Okay. And who would actually rather invest in the machine learning platform? Oh, very good. Excellent. This is a right speaker for the right audience. That's great. I hope you will enjoy this talk then. So like I said, we've been on this journey for the past 5 to 6 years. And you'll see some glimpses of the journey that we've been through. And like Cindy said, I'll be more than happy to take any questions later on if you have any. You can also reach me by email if you can't get hold of me today. So let's get started. So as I said, there's been an explosion of big data, machine learning, and cloud computing. This is an eye chart, but it's just to sort of illustrate the point that there's been a lot of activity in this space. But I think fundamentally, there's been a lack of enough progress, I should say, in investments in improving the quality of your data or our data. In fact, the explosion in these areas, big data, machine learning, cloud computing, has been so much that these terms and some of these, the usage of these terms have actually made their way into our day-to-day lives. For example, did you know that the name of the horse that actually won the 2017 Preakness Derby was actually cloud computing? Starbucks has a new flavor called Cloud Macchiato. It's actually been promoted quite well. I thought I was the first one to see it at Providence Airport, but actually it's all over. I saw it in the hotel today as well. And then there's something called cloud bread, which some of you might be familiar with, but I just found out that apparently it's good for you, so I'm going to go home and try it. But like I said, are we focused on the right thing? There's been a lot of activity in this machine learning, cloud computing, big data space, right, from a technology perspective, and maybe even in the application of these technologies. But are we really focused on the right thing, and can we actually truly derive the value promised or the promised value from these technologies if we don't invest in improving the quality of our data and making the data available for these technologies? So setting the context a little bit, the reason why there's been so much focus on machine learning and the application of these technologies on our data sets is just because historically we've all been sort of focused on collecting the data, curating the data, and sort of feeding that or making that available for analysis and insights, the left side of the screen here. That's what I call as the information collection perspective. So we've been on this journey of collecting the data, curating it, and making it available for analysis. And about probably 3-4 years back or 5 years back, I think based on a multitude of variables, sponsorship, leadership getting frustrated with people going in and asking for more and more money in, oh, we need to build this new data management platform or system, they started saying, well, what if we invert the pyramid? I need to see more value coming out of all these investments. And so immediately, there was a huge sort of push in going towards well, let's sort of use machine learning to sort of create new insights and show it to leadership and sponsorship. The problem is the data is not computationally accessible or available for these tools and technologies to deliver on their value promise. So hence, the inversion of the pyramid to a decision-making paradigm where people want to just apply these technologies to sort of magically create insights from their data sets hasn't actually quite worked out for a lot of us. And just to give you a sense of how big this problem is, I found these statistics online. About 30% of all employees' time is still spent trying to find documents within the enterprise. Knowledge workers spend about 15 to 35% of their time searching for information within an organization. And in most cases, about 50% of the time, they're successful in finding what they're trying to find. 40% of corporate users reported that they cannot find the information they need to do their jobs on their intranets. And about 15% of all paper handled in businesses is lost. So these are just some statistics. Obviously, every company is different, every organization is different, every industry is different, but generally speaking, this probably reflects true for your companies and organizations as well. The other problem is that while there are technologies that have been labeled as big data, and we all want to apply those to our data sets, I think in the life sciences industry, we probably don't have a big data problem. I think what we have, and I have another slide later on, what I call as the lots of small data problem, okay? So we collect a lot of data, we collect a lot of diverse kinds of data sets. Our scale of or volume of data collection is probably not as big as of other industries. So in terms of the 4 V's of big data, so the volume and velocity sort of V's of big data are probably manageable for us. The variety and scalability problems, though, are probably more applicable for us, right? The diversity of the data. So big data is not necessarily our problem. Our problem is that we have lots of diverse data sets, and we want to sort of combine all these data sets to make meaning out of all of that. About 5 years or 6 years back, when we started on this journey, we wanted to create an end-to-end data ecosystem, and I'll show you what our challenges, what kind of challenges we defined that we have to solve with the data ecosystem. You might have seen versions of this slide before, or this term before. Gartner coined this term called dark data a few years back, and the idea behind this term was, going back to that slide about the metrics and statistics, there's a lot of data that we do have within our organizations that our users are not able to find. So the term dark data implies the data exists, but it's hard to find. We like to call it the sneaker net problem. Usually, when people try to find data within the organization, they do 2 things. They either pick up the phone or call somebody, actually 3 things, to be digital. They also probably send an email or an instant message or Teams now. Or they get up, put on their sneakers, and walk around, talk to people until they find the data. So there's a lot of information that's scattered across the enterprise in various systems, and only users who are familiar with those systems know how to get that access to the data. So what do? When you need access to the data? You go talk to that person. So we have a dark data challenge that we wanted to solve. We also had defined a problem called crossing the chasm. Historically, we've all been focused on capturing the data and focused on more of collecting the data or data entry. So remember, 10 years back or 15 years back, we didn't have electronic systems. So what did we do? We used to document all the work that we did in paper notebooks or on paper. And then came the whole wave of electronification, right? So we sort of implemented electronic systems to capture all the data. And so we've been on this sort of data entry curve, if you may. Now, fast forward to the last few years, we've all want to sort of jump onto this other growth curve of data access and analytics. The problem is that there's a big gap the chasm between those two, right? Culturally and technically, we got to solve those problems and cross the chasm, right? So the technical aspects obviously can be met with the technologies that we started with, the big data, machine learning, and other technologies. The cultural challenge still exists, and it's still relevant, right? So if you're talking to R&D lab scientists or people in the manufacturing operations in a big pharma, you have to deal with the cultural challenge of sort of teaching them not just putting data into an electronic system, but tagging it with the right metadata. You've all sort of had those discussions, I'm pretty sure. The other challenge we wanted to solve was this problem of bi-directional flow of information. In a big pharma, typically the product moves in one direction, from research through development into manufacturing, right? And in these three sort of big areas within a big pharma, there's a lot of data and computational models that are used across all the three sort of stages of the development of a product. The problem is there is no bi-directional flow of information, so we rarely ever get a feedback loop from manufacturing back into development and sometimes back all the way into research. So we wanted to solve this problem as well, right? We not only wanted to sort of have a forward loop of information, we also wanted a bi-directional, also backward loop, so we get to know more about what happened with this product that we just pushed through the pipeline so that we are better prepared to work on the next product. Some other challenges. In the past few years, there's been an increased focus on data integrity or regulatory compliance. Agencies are asking for more and more original raw data files, the actual files that were generated by lab instruments or equipment that are currently spread across multiple storage systems. Inspectors have actually stated and said that quality is of concern if data cannot be found within minutes. We're also being asked to accelerate, as all of you know. So it's easier for any big pharma to sort of accelerate certain number of products simultaneously, but going beyond that sort of threshold requires new capabilities and new ways of working that we currently don't have. One of the ideas that we had was, well, what if we had high throughput data analysis to support high throughput acceleration of products? Rapid access to high quality data, we thought, will also increase our use of predictive models and tools and computational tools, resulting in faster progression of the portfolio. And then new insights are needed to advance the portfolio. So on-demand analysis on properties of materials and molecules are getting even more increasingly common nowadays. And to do that, you need to sort of have an end-to-end data ecosystem. So let's talk about what we then decided to do in planning out this data ecosystem, right? So we've seen the challenges, and so how we set about the planning for this data ecosystem. Just to repeat the problem again, we said, remember that to search, find, and explore this growing pool of information that we have and that continues to grow, a typical end user needs to know all of these. They need to know the systems where this data resides. They need to understand how to get or navigate to those systems. They need to know how to get access to those systems. They need to know what that data is stored as in that system. And this is a key point we'll come back to later. The names or the IDs or the identifiers that you use to tag your data is extremely important. How do you actually use those systems to search for the data you're trying to find? And then last but not the least, do you have trust, and how do you know the accuracy of the information that system is giving you in the context of the problem you're trying to solve? It's a tall order if you think about it in a structured manner, isn't it? And we had to sort of spend some time thinking about this problem ourselves to explain it to our sort of users. Many information gathering steps or activities actually fail at step one, which is why you go back to the dark data problem and sort of put on your sneakers and walk around. It's hard to keep up with all the systems and databases we have and that continue to grow, both inside the organization as well as externally. So then what do? We then revert to the people or the systems that we do know. It's also important to think about data from a slightly different perspective. Data, when it's generated based on a direct request, is what we call as the primary market for the data. So why are you running this lab instrument? Why are you running this experiment? There's a specific reason or purpose you're trying to solve. That's what we call as the primary market for the data. Then there's the secondary market for the data, which is where there's no direct request for accessing or creating the data. The focus is actually on generating new insights by mining all the data that was created in the primary market, right? So this is where you're doing exploratory data mining. You're trying to sort of apply big data machine learning techniques, right? This is where all that fits. We also thought about data from an information factory, which is a term that Gary Pisano from Harvard uses often to describe the work that happens in big pharma, and also from a data supply chain perspective, right? So if you think about data from its life cycle perspective, you start with the manufacturing, the warehousing or the storage, the repackaging of the data to sort of meet various different use cases that the data might be able to might be used in. Then you distribute the data in various sort of systems or different modalities, the consumption of the data, and then eventually, in some cases, the destruction of the data. So in terms of the three high-level sort of categories these activities span, you can think about it from a data capture, data curation, and the extracting value from the data perspective. We also started thinking about the scope and complexity. So how wide should we start creating this data ecosystem, right? So what's the scope of this data ecosystem? Let me illustrate what we went through in terms of our thinking. And this is just illustrative. Obviously, every organization is different, but we have these organizational sort of structures within pharma, right? So there's a research group, there's a PDM group, there's a drug safety group, a PharmSci group, and a clinical group. There are many more groups, but just to illustrate the point. And then there's a bunch of different data entities we all work with, right? So when you say we want to create a data ecosystem, what does that really mean? It means different things to different people. We also wanted to sort of grade the level of complexity in trying to find this information, right? And depending on where you sit in the organization and what problem you're trying to sort of solve. So let me illustrate. If you are trying to find information on a single entity within one of these silos, then the challenge isn't that hard, so illustrated by the green color, right? So, for example, if you work in research and you're trying to find information about a certain target, you can pretty easily find that information. If you're in a PharmSci organization and you're trying to find a specific experiment that was done 6 years back, we have ways to find that information. It's pretty easy to find that information, and so on and so forth, right? Let's move to the next type of problem. So now you're trying to find relationships between two entities, but you're still within a silo. For example, you're in research and you're trying to find relationships between a target and compounds. Fairly easy. I think pretty much all big pharma companies can say, yeah, we can solve that problem pretty easily, okay? Or if you're in drug safety and you want to sort of find the study report that's stored in your document management system associated to a particular study, well, you can find that information pretty easily as well. Now you get into a more complicated landscape. So now you're trying to find information on a single entity but across these silos, okay? So for example, you're trying to find all information related to a single compound or molecule all the way from research into PharmSci, so spanning all the other lines as well. It can be done, but it's not as straightforward as it should be. I'll skip those in the interest of time. And then this is the hardest problem to solve, where you're actually trying to find what happened to an entity or multiple entities as the product went through all these lines and all these systems. As an example, you start with the compound in research, then you make some batches for that compound. For each of those lots, you have studies, in vivo studies, let's say, or ADME studies that are run in a different silo. You're trying to find then the results of all those studies, and then continuing the journey, you're trying to then say, well, what happened a few years later when that compound made it from research into pharmaceutical sciences or into development? PharmSci made a lot of that compound. Related to the lot, drug safety ran a study, and then guess what? The compound actually continued its journey into clinical. Now you have a lot that was made by PharmSci, we ran a clinical study, and now you want to sort of see if there are any adverse events from these in vivo studies and these clinical studies, and you want to tie them together. A classical problem that we're trying to find answers to, and it's always hard to find all these answers. You can find the answers, it just takes you a long time. So we started to think about the scope of this data ecosystem from using that sort of illustrative chart I shared with you. One other thing about the solution design. So when you think about data, it could mean a lot of different things to different people, right? So there's the data itself that's stored in our system. So where is the data stored? Is the data computationally accessible? You also sometimes are interested in finding documents, right? So what documents do we need to answer a particular question, and where can I find these documents? And sometimes you're more interested in who has worked on this kind of problem, or who are the experts in this space. So we call this the triangle of information aggregation. People actually create documents, people generate data, and data is used to describe documents, and documents contain data, right? So we're trying to sort of create a data ecosystem that can solve all these design considerations. So as you can see, it's getting quite complicated already. So that's why it took us 5 years. Okay, so how did we create this data ecosystem? So first of all, we had to have a mission statement, right? Don't we all need a mission statement? So we said, this is our mission statement. We call this end-to-end data ecosystem as Intelligent Data Framework. We said we wanted to build a robust foundational information architecture and deliver access to internal and external information in an intuitive, self-service manner, allowing efficient knowledge sharing. The key word I like here, there's many words that you'll probably all resonate with, but the key word I like here is self-service. One of the things that we wanted to make sure is that when we create this data ecosystem, it's not, as one of my team members says, yet another technique or technology, right? We didn't want to go to our users and say, here's another tool that you need to learn to use. We wanted to make it intuitive, and we wanted to make it self-service, so there's really no training burden on our SMEs who are already complaining about all the systems they need to use. So the first layer of this data ecosystem was focused on data standards. So the business case for data standards that we wrote was, well, we've been growing through mergers and acquisitions that has then led to the proliferation of multiple systems and standards. I'm sure most of you will resonate with that. Our focus was on, historically has been on eliminating redundant systems because of these acquisitions, or creating huge data warehouses, right? And what we wanted to emphasize to leadership was we really want to invest and implement data standards because they're a critical foundational element for the next layer of the ecosystem, which is data access, okay? So we didn't go to them and say that we wanted to create yet another data warehouse or another tool. We said we want to focus on implementing data standards. What are the benefits of data standards? As you can imagine, when you have a standard and you see it as a standard on multiple products, it sort of levels the playing field, we think, between information producers and information consumers. That's one of the key benefits that we had to explain to our users and to leadership, that this is why we want to invest in data standards. It also creates a common understanding and language across multiple groups. So in my ridiculously complex build slide of the scope and complexity that I showed you before, there's one element on the left-hand side called lot. I don't know if you saw that. We spent probably about 2 or 3 months discussing and debating the terms lot and batch. It was hard. It was really, really hard. So standards help you create that common dictionary or language between multiple groups. And then the other thing that standards do for you is they help you rapidly identify gaps in data quality, which if you ask somebody the question, do you have any issues with data quality, the answer will be what? No. But if you actually show them that, look, here's a gap that you might want to address, the response is much better, and they're like, oh, I didn't know that, and let me go fix it. So we started working on what we call as a conceptual data model, which is a tool that most information architects are familiar with. Again, don't underestimate the complexity of creating something like this. We thought we would be done in a month or so. It took us a good 6 to 10 months to create this. And what it looks like, just to give you a sneak look into this, is it defines a few things. First of all, it defines the entities with a proper definition that we all can agree upon, example, lot and batch. It also illustrates with some examples what we mean by that definition. And then the third thing it provides is it shows the relationships between those entities, okay? This, I think, is the most fundamental piece of work that helped us build our data ecosystem. If you don't have this, I think any data management efforts will be lost, because this is what we still come back to see what our conceptual data model was and how our data ecosystem should work. We also looked externally. There's quite a few data standards that have emerged now that didn't exist about 5-6 years back. So we started with working with, we were a founding member of the Allotrope Consortium, that some of you might be familiar with. It's an industry-wide consortium focused on creating an industry common data format for lab data. Primarily focused on analytical data, but the consortium has been thinking about expanding scope to other areas as well. So the easiest way to think about this is think about XML, what XML did for the data translation and common language as a common language layer. That's what ADF, or the Allotrope data format, is trying to do for lab analytical data. We also are looking towards the FAIR guiding principles and trying to align with the FAIR guiding principles in terms of the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of data. So we're trying to sort of implement those principles into our data ecosystem as well. So that was the first layer of the data ecosystem, the data standards. The second layer is what we call as foundational services. Once you have defined your data entities and the relationships, what you need next, we thought, was a push and pull architecture that we could use to sort of connect our systems, okay? So going back to the lot and batch example, we had a case where our users would actually generate a lot ID from system A and then hand type that lot ID into system B, right? Probably a use case that most of you are familiar with. What we said, well, we don't want to do that because then there could be transcription errors, right? And the quality of data goes down. So what we said was, what we need is to have a web services framework, we call it foundational services, that can connect those two systems. So in system B, when you're actually entering or registering that lot ID, you no longer have a free text box. You have a drop-down list that's fed from system A. Make sense? Easy peasy, right? Well, it was not that easy 5 years back when we explained this to our users. But the idea of foundational services was, well, we'll take the data from the data producers, we'll aggregate all the data, curate it if needed, and then publish it into the systems that are the consumers of that data, right? So that's what foundational services wanted to do. And then the way it looks like is something like this. This is just a small subset of the overall framework. But it's key because you'll see there's a lot of producing systems and consuming systems. Just to illustrate the point, if this works, okay. So we pull compound IDs from one of these systems, and then we feed those compound IDs into multiple systems. right? And the idea there is, if it's not registered in your originating authoritative source system, you shouldn't be allowed to use it in some of the downstream systems, which is a problem that we used to have before. All right, so far so good. We have data standards, we have foundational services to do this push and pull mechanism, right? So now we still have the problem of accessing all this data. We still have multiple systems, and we didn't want our users to keep going to multiple systems, right, to find all this information. So the solution design sort of framework or requirements we wrote for this data access layer were something like this. We want to provide access to data in an intuitive manner. We wanted to provide a bird's eye view, and this phrase is key because you'll see how the system looks later on. A bird's eye view to view our data that provides the users the ability to find and connect the data, but not have to go to these systems. It must be web-based, a fundamental principle nowadays. It must be scalable to take advantage of different types of data sources, and it should allow for mining beyond the initial question and support what-if exploration, okay? So what we looked towards for a solution for this problem was linked data, or semantic web technologies, or RDF. And the idea there was, well, we already know through our data standards work what our data entities are and what are the properties of each of those data entities. We know what systems they are produced in and what systems they are consumed in. That's the second layer that you saw. Well, why can't we then answer questions like these, right? So these were some illustrative questions that we gave to the technical team, saying this system should be able to answer these questions very quickly and very effectively, okay? This is what the system then looks like. It's a semantic web-based linked data browser, which effectively what it does is it lets us pull data or connect data from multiple systems without having to sort of create a data warehouse or creating a physical data model for all that information. I know it's a little hard to read, but let me show you the value of this. This is a, think of it like a mind map. If you've used Mind Manager, it's a mind map of data that any user of this system can build. It's not restricted based on where you come from or where you sit in the organization. There are some restrictions, I should clarify. If you're in a certain part of the organization, you shouldn't be allowed to see certain data sets. So we have those controls built in. But generally speaking, it's an open browser that anybody can create a data map from. You'll see some entities that are coming from research systems. You'll see some entities that are connected to research entities that are coming from preclinical or development systems. And then you'll see entities that are coming from a clinical systems. So without having to create a massive infrastructure or a huge data warehouse, we've actually connected the dots, literally, from various systems to show users the information that they are looking for and how that data is connected to each other, okay? The cool thing about this is it's a shareable map as well. So if I create this map, I can share it with another colleague, and we can both edit the map in real time. Then we focused on unstructured text a little bit. And this continues to be a journey. We haven't completely solved this, but we also then started thinking about what about all the information? Remember the triangle of the data, people, and documents? What about the documents piece, right? What about all the data that sits inside our documents? So what we did was we said, we already have this data access tool. Can we actually extract data from our documents and make that available into this tool, right? So then as a user, you don't care where this information is coming from anyway, but when we now have a single system that lets you explore structured data as well as unstructured data. So what we started working on is identifying key documents from which we wanted to extract data that's historically captured in tables or whatever structures within Word that you use, extract that information and make it available in this semantic web browser, right? So we've done that. We call it documents to data. And then we paused. So this was about 2.5 years back. We said, we've done a lot. Have we covered everything? Have we covered all the types of data that we care about? And we went back to our users, did surveys, and we found out that actually there's two more key data sets or types that we haven't focused on. For example, what about the raw scientific data that we capture or generate from our lab instruments? So far, we've only talked about data from documents, data about people, and data from structured repositories. We haven't addressed the raw scientific data that comes out from our lab instruments. And on the other hand, they also said we're increasingly using computational models and predictive tools. And what about all the simulated data, right? Where is that going? So specifically for these two data sets or types of data, we started thinking again about the life cycle of this information. We thought about this from a 4 quadrants perspective. So if you think about scientific data or simulated data, it originates from the point of capture, your lab instruments or manufacturing equipment. That data then is, like I said, the primary data market, right? The primary use for creating that data exists, and that data is fed into our electronic systems or reports. That's the use quadrant. And then there's the secondary market, which is the reuse. So modelers, as well as people who want to sort of mine data from the primary market to create new insights, use spreadsheets or whatever tools they have access to mine all that data. And then last but not the least, the simulated data is from the predict quadrant, where we use high-performance computing as a hosting platform and various computational models, some that we have self-developed, some that we work with academic institutions to develop, and some are commercial tools that we buy from vendors. So when we looked at the 4 quadrants, we wanted to understand the flow of information across these 4 quadrants. And we found out that the sneaker net problem is still true for these 2 data sets, right? People still rely on people to move data between these 4 quadrants. We wanted to get rid of that. And as inspiration for that, something that we all know came to mind. So for Apple, Apple created an ecosystem to enable all its devices, right? No matter what device you use, you are still sort of hooked on to iTunes, App Store, and iCloud to synchronize data across all your devices. So we thought about this and we said, well, that's interesting. Maybe there's something to learn from there to create something for data. If this works, okay. So as a further inspiration, we said, well, when was the last time you ever took a picture or video on your smartphone and had to do these 3 things? When did you have to name your file, organize your folders, right? And by the way, remember that information forever. But you never do that, right? Why? Because you rely on the ecosystem. Well, we said, well, why can't we do this for data? So we call this platform the Scientific Data Cloud. And the idea is pretty simple, same as the Apple ecosystem. We said, well, what if we could actually sweep data directly from the point of capture into the cloud? We could then do whatever transformation or automation on that data set in the cloud, right? So case in point, you take a raw file from an HPLC or a mass spec instrument, and your SMEs could give you various formats in how to render that information. You know, SME 1 could say, I need these 5 columns, and SME 2 could say, I need these 6 columns. That's fine. We can write all these scripts in the cloud. The data is then made available to our systems and to our reports. The data is also made available into our secondary market, right? So you'll see that from the previous picture, you had primarily Excel there. That was on purpose. And now we can actually, with the data cloud behind it, we can actually enable more sophisticated tools like Spotfire or Tableau or what have you. So the idea is these tools are configured to pull data directly from the cloud. And then the simulated data in the predict quadrant, you'll see that we can actually sweep data as soon as a model creates this data into the cloud, and then we can actually feed data that's needed as an input back into these tools as well. Okay? So that was the idea behind Scientific Data Cloud. It's a GXP compliant. We think it's the industry's first, but maybe it's not. But it's definitely one of the first GXP compliant storage and analytics system. So we didn't want to create a black box of a storage system. We wanted to create a storage and an analytics system for both lab and manufacturing data. And that leverages big data and cloud computing technologies. So finally, I'm back to the first slide, big data and cloud computing. And with this, what we've been able to do is, for the first time, we think we've been able to achieve data convergence, which results in speed and quality. So we not only have experimental data and real data, non-simulated data going into the Scientific Data Cloud. We also have simulated data from all our models and predictive tools that we use going into the Scientific Data Cloud, which now enables rapid model development and verification for our users. So you can actually, as a computational model, look at your simulated data, compare it to your experimental data, and actually improve the performance of your model. And then it also enables specifically, almost think of it as a virtual design of experimentation, right? So our users can now actually access all this data, understand what experiments they need to do before they go into a lab, right? And obviously resulting in speed and quality in delivering our portfolio. So finally, we have a complete data ecosystem. We have data standards and foundational services. We have a system where you can quickly link and see the connections between data. We also have, for our raw data and simulated data, the Scientific Data Cloud. And the idea is that all three pieces now work seamlessly with each other. Now, why are we doing all this, and what are the key takeaways? How much time do I have, Cindy? How much time do I have? 3 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. So, key takeaways. Like I said, we don't have big data. We have lots of small data, right? If you're in the retail industry, then you have lots of data of the same kind. In our sort of industry, you have lots of data, but of different kinds. So key point. How do you make sense out of lots of small data? Well, you add meaning to it. You use data standards, vocabularies, and ontologies, right, to sort of define meaning to all this lots of small data. In conclusion, because of our complete data ecosystem, from one single data repository, which is an end-to-end data ecosystem, we can actually do on-demand reaction profiling. We can do on-demand continuous manufacturing, which is new for us, analysis. Just to give you an illustration of that, we generate with our continuous manufacturing for drug products about, and this is in the development scale, not even commercial manufacturing, we create about 2,600 data points every second. And that's new for us. We didn't have a way to sort of analyze and capture all that information, but now we do. We can do mass-based absorption analysis, and we can do advanced PAT analysis, all from one single repository. We are doing machine learning. I didn't want to sort of take away from the fact that there's been a lot of explosion in this area, but we're not doing anything. Machine-readable data is a prerequisite for machine learning, and now we have it. Okay, and just an example, 2 examples. We are doing deep learning of particle characteristics for downstream process optimization. We feed microscope images of crystal structures. We apply a deep learning algorithm to it, and then we automate the classification of these crystal structure shapes and further analysis. We also do applied deep learning for image similarity assessment. If I play a song for you, and if it's a popular song, you all will recognize the song. Well, if we look at a spectra or a scan or a chart, our users should be able to recognize the same thing, right? So, or a system should be able to recognize the same thing. So that's the approach we're taking here, giving an ability to sort of find similar images or scans from a historical database using deep learning. In conclusion, in 2017, I believe, at an ISPE conference, Roger Connor, the head of manufacturing at GSK, said in a public forum that he has a problem. And his problem was that no one calls pharma for advice, right? In this area, in data and digital innovation. Well, it's 2019. I think we're ready. Call us. Thank you.